It was a crisp autumn morning when Ethan Carter, a tall, well-built African-American man in his late 40s, stepped onto the porch of his modest ranch-style home in the upscale Maplewood Estates gated community. The early sun cast long shadows across the neatly manicured lawns, and the air smelled faintly of fallen leaves. But the tranquility of the morning was shattered when Ethan noticed a sheet of paper taped to his front door. The bold, black ink stood out starkly against the white paper, and the message was anything but welcoming. "You have 5 days to vacate the premises, or further action will be taken." Ethan stared at the note, his brow furrowing in confusion. He had lived in Maplewood Estates for years, owned multiple properties in the area, and had never had any issues with the Homeowners Association, HOA. But this note, unsigned and threatening, suggested otherwise. It was as if someone believed he didn't belong in his own home. Ethan peeled the note off the door and stepped back inside, his mind racing. He had purchased this particular property a few months ago, initially renting it out to tenants. When they moved out unexpectedly, Ethan decided to move in himself, enjoying the quiet, safe neighborhood and its proximity to the golf course he loved. But now, it seemed, someone had taken issue with his presence. As he pondered the note, his phone buzzed. It was a text from his longtime friend and property manager, Marcus Reed. "Hey, man. Just a heads up, there's a new HOA president in Maplewood. Her name's Victoria Hartman, and she's been cracking down hard on rule violations. Not sure if it's relevant, but thought you should know." Ethan's eyebrows rose. He had heard whispers about Victoria, a woman in her early 50s with a reputation for being overzealous about enforcing HOA rules. Residents had started calling her the enforcer behind her back, and it seemed her reign was already causing waves. Ethan sighed and set his phone down. He had no intention of leaving his home, but he knew he needed to get to the bottom of this. The note had no signature, no official letterhead, just a vague threat. Whoever had left it clearly believed they had the authority to evict him, but Ethan wasn't about to let that happen without a fight. The confrontation. Later that morning, as Ethan was finishing a call with one of his real estate partners, there was a sharp knock at the door. The kind of knock that suggested impatience. Ethan opened the door to find a woman standing there, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her crisp white blouse and pressed slacks giving off an air of authority. She introduced herself as Victoria Hartman, the new HOA president. "Hello," she said, her tone clipped. "I'm Victoria Hartman, the HOA president. Are you the resident here?" She emphasized the word resident, as if questioning his right to be there. "I'm Ethan Carter," he replied evenly, not missing the way her lips pursed at his friendly tone. "How can I help you, Victoria?" She gave him a tight smile. "I've received multiple complaints that someone is illegally occupying this unit. The homeowners here are very particular about who is allowed in Maplewood. They only lease to thoroughly vetted individuals. This is highly irregular." Ethan had to steady himself to hold back a smirk. Her voice dripped with condescension, completely unaware that she was speaking to the legitimate homeowner. "Do you have paperwork proving you're supposed to be here?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. "Paperwork," Ethan repeated, feigning confusion. "Like a lease agreement or something?" "Yes," she said, crossing her arms. "A lease agreement, a letter from the current owner, something that says you have the right to live here. Because if not," she interrupted herself, "I'm afraid you'll have to vacate. It's not personal, but Maplewood simply cannot tolerate squatters." Ethan calmly tilted his head. "You're worried about squatters?" Victoria nodded sharply. "Yes, we have zero tolerance for that here. The property owner reached out to us, or so I was told," she added quickly, her eyes darting away for a second. Ethan realized she was bluffing. No property owner had reached out to her. He was the property owner. This was nothing but prejudice wrapped in official-sounding language. With a measured breath, Ethan said, "I'm sorry, but I haven't broken in anywhere. I'm going to kindly suggest you verify your information before making accusations." Victoria's cheeks flushed. "I don't have time for games. If you're illegally renting, get the documentation to me by noon tomorrow. Otherwise, the HOA will proceed with an eviction filing on behalf of the homeowner." "Understood." Ethan nodded, hiding a small grin. "Believe me, I'll have something for you soon." Victoria turned on her heel and marched away, leaving Ethan standing in the doorway. As she strode down the sidewalk, the brand-new sign in front of the neighboring lot caught his eye. It read, "HOA Office and Meeting Hall, next right." They had built a small office near the entrance for the new president and her staff. Ethan laughed under his breath. This woman had no idea what she had just stepped into. He was tempted to clarify things immediately, but something in him decided to wait. If Victoria Hartman wanted to play this game, maybe a day or two of suspense wouldn't hurt. Besides, he was curious to see just how far she'd go. The towing incident. The following morning, Ethan was jolted awake by a persistent clamor at his front gate. He threw on his slippers and stepped outside to find a man in khakis and a polo shirt emblazoned with the HOA logo. Beside him was a tow truck driver, hooking up Ethan's beloved vintage Thunderbird. "Hey," Ethan shouted, stepping closer. "What do you think you're doing?" The man in the polo shirt turned to him. HOA regulations state that an illegally parked or inoperable vehicle is subject to towing, he rattled off, pointing to a sticker slapped on the Thunderbird's windshield. "Violating Maplewood parking ordinances." "That's my classic car," Ethan barked, keeping his voice calm but firm. "I park it on my own driveway. How is that illegal?" The man pointed to a small oil spot on the pavement. "We have guidelines about fluid leaks, sir. This vehicle appears to be leaking oil. That's an environmental hazard." Ethan rubbed his temples. "So you're telling me that because of a couple of drops of oil, you're towing my car without any warning?" From the corner of his eye, Ethan spotted Victoria standing on the sidewalk, arms folded, looking very pleased with herself. "I trust this gentleman told you about the violation," she said. "He's on the association's compliance team. As I said, we take any sign of neglect seriously." Ethan almost laughed. He recognized the tactic, a flurry of petty citations to harass him. He'd seen it happen to other homeowners under different HOAs, but never quite this blatantly. Victoria was determined to make him uncomfortable enough to leave. "Stop the tow," Ethan said calmly to the driver. The driver shrugged. "I can't. I got orders from the HOA. I'll cover your fee," Ethan quickly interjected, pulling his wallet from his pocket. "Would you prefer a direct payment? Because if you tow this car, you're in violation of my rights as the property owner." Victoria's face flickered with confusion. "Property owner?" She stepped forward. "As far as we know, you're a tenant. If that's the case, don't pull these stunts." Ethan held her gaze. "I strongly suggest you both take a minute to verify what you think you know." Something in his voice must have struck a chord with the tow truck driver, who hesitated and finally said, "Look, lady, are you 100% sure this guy is a squatter?" Victoria appeared flustered. "Just do your job," she snapped. But the driver, probably more interested in avoiding a potential lawsuit, unhooked the Thunderbird with a weary sigh. "I'll hold off for now," he muttered. "But if I get official HOA documentation, I'll be back." Once the truck had rattled away, Victoria advanced on Ethan. "You're interfering with official HOA business. That's a second violation. Keep this up, and I won't have to wait for a court order to get you out of here." Ethan folded his arms. "Thank you for giving me a heads up. By the way, were you the one who left that eviction notice on my door yesterday?" She sniffed. "I did, yes. We have to keep our neighborhood secure. People have been complaining about a strange car parked here, about someone who doesn't match the usual profile for Maplewood. If you keep making this difficult, the authorities will be involved next." Ethan's jaw clenched, but he forced a thin smile. "I appreciate your diligence. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting to prepare for." He stepped inside and quietly shut the door, his hands shaking with a mixture of anger and amusement. Victoria's brazen approach was so over the top, it was almost comical. He wanted nothing more than to reveal the truth right now, to stop her dead in her tracks. But part of him still wanted to wait, to show up at the next HOA board meeting and drop the bomb in front of everyone. The HOA meeting. The Maplewood Estates HOA met every second Thursday in a newly built community hall. Usually, such meetings were quiet affairs, mostly retirees and homeowners discussing budgets, landscaping, and pool maintenance fees. But tonight, Victoria had scheduled an urgent session about illegal occupancy problems, effectively turning the meeting into a spectacle. When Ethan arrived, the room was already buzzing. Rows of plastic chairs were set up in front of a small desk, with a wooden podium standing to one side. Victoria sat at a table with 3 other board members, all in business casual attire and wearing the HOA emblem pin on their collars. Ethan lingered at the back, quietly observing. A couple of longtime residents recognized him from years ago. He had owned a different rental in Maplewood that he'd since sold, and they gave him polite nods. But it seemed most of the new folks had no idea who he was. Victoria cleared her throat and began the meeting. Good evening, everyone. First on the agenda, we have a pressing concern about a non-vetted occupant residing at 1547 Hemlock Lane. We suspect this individual has no legal right to be there. She scanned the room, her voice full of authority. Now, Maplewood has prided itself on strict adherence to rules that keep our neighborhoods safe and beautiful. When an unauthorized individual stays in a home, not only does it undermine the property's integrity, it also jeopardizes the safety of our community. We have reason to believe this occupant has refused to comply with our request for documentation and has even challenged official HOA enforcement. Soft murmurs rippled among the attendees. Victoria continued, "This occupant was served an informal notice, and he refused to vacate. We're considering the next step, a formal eviction. This is not a decision we take lightly, but it's vital to maintain order in Maplewood." She took a breath, then gestured to a portly gentleman on her right. "I'd like to open the floor to our board members, who have also received complaints from neighbors about suspicious behavior at 1547 Hemlock Lane." Before the man could speak, Ethan raised his hand. "I'd like to respond to these allegations." All eyes pivoted toward him. Victoria froze, visibly annoyed. "Sir, please identify yourself for the record." "Ethan Carter," he said, striding forward. "And I'm the occupant in question at 1547 Hemlock Lane." A hush fell over the hall. Victoria huffed. "I suppose you're here to spin a story." Ethan stood at the podium, scanning the crowd. "I'm here to tell the truth. For those of you who don't know me, I've owned property in Maplewood before. Some of you might remember me. I sold that unit a few years back. But I recently purchased another house here." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Yes, purchased. I am the rightful owner of 1547 Hemlock Lane." A stunned silence came over the audience. Victoria let out an incredulous laugh. "That's impossible. The homeowner is someone else. I've seen the records." Ethan nodded. "I'm sure you've seen old records. The property was in the middle of an interstate probate transfer. The previous owner was my Aunt Regina Carter. She passed away last year, leaving the house to me. The title has been in my name for months." He pulled out a folder containing copies of the deed, probate court rulings, and final closing documents. "Here's the official paperwork, with the county stamp." Victoria's face grew beet red as she fumbled with the papers Ethan handed to a board member, who then passed them down. The hush gave way to a ripple of murmuring from neighbors. "That can't be right," Victoria stammered. "I was told, someone told me." Ethan allowed himself a small smile. "I suspect you assumed, based on your conversations with unnamed sources, that I was some freeloader. Yet you never bothered to check the updated county records, which are a matter of public record. If you had, you'd see the title is in my name." One of the board members, who had been flipping through Ethan's paperwork, cleared his throat. "Miss Hartman, these documents seem legitimate." He looked at Ethan apologetically. "I recognize the county seal. This looks authentic." Victoria sputtered. "But he hasn't paid HOA dues or participated in mandatory orientation. How could he?" Ethan nodded. "I tried to attend an orientation last month, but the schedule changed. Meanwhile, I have paid HOA dues. I have the canceled checks if you'd like to see them." From the back of the hall, a woman whispered, "He's the owner." Another murmured, "So the HOA's been harassing a perfectly legal resident." Victoria's shoulders sagged. "Why didn't you tell me you were the owner from the beginning?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You never bothered to ask. You barged in with accusations of squatting, eviction notices, and towing attempts. You didn't approach me as a neighbor or even as the HOA president with standard courtesy. This was a done deal in your mind before it even started." The tension in the room was palpable. Some folks looked mortified, others curious or amused at Victoria's predicament. Victoria smoothed her hair, trying to regain composure. "Well, now we know you're the owner. We apologize for the misunderstanding. But Maplewood has rules, and we must ensure compliance from all new owners." Ethan pressed on. "I'm not disputing the importance of rules, but the manner in which you enforce them, without verifying your information, was reckless. Furthermore, you threatened to evict me from my own home, which is as serious as it gets." The portly gentleman on the board cleared his throat again. "We appreciate your bringing the proper documentation, Mr. Carter. I believe we owe you an apology for the confusion. He cast an uneasy glance at Victoria. Victoria inhaled sharply, then exhaled as she grudgingly said, "Yes, I apologize for the inconvenience. It was never the intention of the HOA to target you." Ethan finished, "It sure felt that way." She bristled. "I assure you, Maplewood does not discriminate. We simply had incomplete records. Now that the matter is cleared up, I trust you'll abide by the guidelines like everyone else." Her tone was cold, but Ethan decided not to push further. This was enough for now. "I plan to," he said calmly. Then, turning to the board, he added, "I have some other concerns about how my property was handled. The towing attempt, for example, and the repeated threatening notices taped to my door. Not to mention the so-called eviction notice that wasn't from any official source. I'd like that addressed." Victoria appeared flustered, but one of the other board members nodded. "That's fair, Mr. Carter. We'll review those incidents. We'd be happy to hear your side in a formal complaint session." Victoria tried to pivot the conversation quickly to landscaping updates, but the damage was done. Everyone in that room realized the squatter was actually the rightful homeowner, and the ringmaster of the fiasco was the brand-new HOA president. The aftermath. As the meeting adjourned, Ethan stood near the exit. A few people came up to shake his hand. One older woman said quietly, "I'm so sorry this happened to you. Victoria can be a bit overbearing. She just moved in last year, and she's been taking these rules to heart a bit too aggressively." Ethan nodded in appreciation. "Thank you. I hope we can all get along moving forward." With that, he walked out into the cool evening air. He had revealed the truth in the most public way possible. Now, all that remained to be seen was how Victoria would react to being humiliated in front of the entire community, and what repercussions, if any, he'd face for standing his ground. The fallout. The fallout from the HOA meeting was immediate. Within days, Victoria found herself fielding complaints from neighbors who were irate that she had nearly evicted a legal owner. Adding to her troubles, Maplewood's code enforcement volunteers expressed concern about her high-handed style. The spectacle had dragged the board into an uncomfortable spotlight. Ethan's days, meanwhile, were calmer. He was enjoying the crisp autumn weather, taking walks around the neighborhood, and meeting more of his neighbors face to face. Many recognized him now, greeting him with a smile when he passed by. Folks walking their dogs or tending their gardens would wave and chat about the fiasco. Some joked about Victoria the HOA queen, but Ethan, being respectful, simply said, "Everyone makes mistakes." Yet Victoria didn't seem content to let the dust settle. A week after the meeting, Ethan received a letter from the HOA's compliance committee, citing him for an unapproved vehicle in his driveway. This time, it referenced a friend's car that Ethan had borrowed while his Thunderbird got a routine tune-up. The letter stated that any extended guest vehicle must be registered with the HOA if it stayed overnight for more than 3 days. Ethan rolled his eyes. Technically, the rule was indeed in the official bylaws, though rarely enforced unless someone had a junker car that sat for months. But he decided it was easier to just fill out the form. He wasn't looking for another fight. When he dropped off the paperwork at the HOA office, he found only the young volunteer at the front desk. "Is Victoria in?" Ethan asked, half hoping she wasn't. The volunteer shook her head. "I'm sorry. She's out today. She's been absent all week, actually. The vice president's been filling in." As Ethan left, a gray-haired man in the lobby whispered, "She hasn't shown up since the blow-up at the meeting. Word is, the board's questioning whether she's fit to remain president." It didn't surprise him. Victoria had embarrassed the entire HOA by basing her actions on hearsay rather than facts. Ethan almost felt bad for her. Almost. The apology. That evening, the doorbell rang at Ethan's house. To his surprise, there stood Victoria, wearing a crisp coat, her face set in a determined frown. "Good evening," Ethan said neutrally. "Here to deliver another violation notice?" Victoria inhaled, as if bracing herself. "May I come in?" Ethan hesitated but stepped aside. "Sure. What's on your mind?" She walked into the living room, surveying the tidy space with new eyes, no longer looking to accuse, but possibly to understand. She cleared her throat. "I want to, apologize again. Properly. I realized that my approach was heavy-handed. My actions were based on incomplete information, and I should have followed standard procedure for verifying property records. I regret that." Ethan studied her carefully. It took a lot for someone like Victoria to come in person. He gave a small nod. Apology noted. I appreciate you saying that. She clenched her jaw, looking pained. I also want you to know. I'm resigning from the HOA board. Ethan blinked. Resigning? Are you sure that's necessary? She looked away. The board believes my behavior constituted an overreach of authority. I can't say they're wrong. I might have let the position go to my head. Ethan recalled how smug she had been at first, certain that she wielded unstoppable power. It was quite a turnaround. If you think that's best, it's your choice. But you might consider staying and just changing your approach. Victoria stared at the floor. The truth is, I moved here to Maplewood after my divorce, and I guess I've been struggling to feel in control of anything in my life. This job was supposed to help me shape the neighborhood in a positive way. Instead, I ended up alienating people. She lifted her gaze, meeting Ethan's eyes. I assumed you were just another troublemaker. I realize now that was prejudice, plain and simple. And I'm deeply ashamed. Silence filled the room. Ethan had expected many things. More conflict, more petty citations, or maybe a complete disappearance. He hadn't expected a heartfelt confession. After a moment, Ethan responded quietly, I appreciate your honesty, Victoria. I can't pretend it didn't hurt or that I was okay with how you handled things. But I prefer we move on in a positive way. She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. Thank you. As she left, Ethan found himself feeling a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. He'd seen bitter feuds in other HOAs tear neighborhoods apart, but maybe Maplewood could avoid that fate if people were willing to learn from mistakes. A new beginning. A few days later, Ethan attended yet another HOA meeting. This time, it was a smaller group gathered for a special session. The vice president, a retired school principal named Rosalind, introduced a motion to accept Victoria's resignation. Before we proceed, Rosalind said, Victoria asked to address the board one last time. Victoria stood, her hands visibly trembling. She apologized formally for her behavior and acknowledged the harm it had caused. Then, in a surprising turn, she asked the board to consider her for a lesser role, perhaps a volunteer or assistant in charge of neighborhood beautification projects, so she could still contribute while learning the ropes more carefully. The board discussed. After some debate, they agreed. Victoria would step down from the presidency but remain a volunteer, focusing on organizing gardening events, community cleanups, and social gatherings, areas where she couldn't unilaterally enforce rules. It was a compromise that might give her a chance to redeem herself. Ethan watched from the back row. He was pleasantly surprised by the board's leniency. This was a small suburban community, after all, and people here valued second chances when real change seemed possible. By the time the meeting concluded, Rosalind had stepped up as interim president. Next on the agenda, she said, we have a petition from Mr. Carter regarding unnecessary towing attempts and harassment. She looked at Ethan. We'd like to resolve that now, if possible. Ethan approached the table. I want to be clear, my petition isn't about punishing anyone. I just don't want neighbors to experience the same treatment I did because of bureaucratic errors or bias. Rosalind nodded. We understand. We'll establish new guidelines for verifying occupancy and ownership, so no one is harassed without due process. And we'll ensure that compliance officers follow a standardized protocol, no arbitrary tows or eviction notices. A sense of relief washed over Ethan. That sounds fair. I think Maplewood could be a great community for everyone if we keep things transparent and respectful. A gentle applause filled the room, and with that, the session ended on a more hopeful note. People chatted amiably as they left. Victoria approached Ethan one last time, a weak but genuine smile on her face. He gave her a small nod, letting her know they were on the path to a better understanding. The transformation. In the weeks that followed, Ethan saw a noticeable shift in the neighborhood's atmosphere. Victoria stepped back from policing driveways and mailboxes, instead focusing on landscaping the front entrance with seasonal flowers and organizing a fall festival. The petty violation notices dropped drastically. During the fall festival, complete with food trucks and live music, Ethan noticed Victoria in a corner, painting a face on a laughing child's cheek. She looked content, far from the stern figure who had once pounded on his door with eviction threats. It was amazing how a little accountability and self-awareness could transform someone's approach to community life. Neighbors began to relax, chatting on sidewalks, and forging genuine connections. Ethan found himself hosting casual barbecues, inviting new friends to share stories. Every so often, he'd catch Victoria's eye from across a community event, and she'd offer a polite wave. There was no magic wand that erased the past, but there was something to be said about honest effort. Ethan's biggest takeaway from the fiasco was the power of assumptions. One misguided notion had nearly driven him from his own property. Yet, by shedding light on the truth, inviting accountability, and refusing to meet hostility with more hostility, Ethan had done more than just reclaim his rightful place. He had also changed a community that was willing to learn. As the months rolled on, Maplewood became a place where owners and renters alike felt welcome. The rigid lines of prejudice and elitism softened under a newfound culture of communication and respect. People began to see each other less as violators of arbitrary rules and more as neighbors simply trying to enjoy life in a suburban paradise. For Ethan Carter, proud homeowner of 1547 Hemlock Lane, the ordeal turned out to be a strange blessing in disguise. Not only did he stand up for his rights, but he also helped shift the very heart of Maplewood's HOA. And for Victoria Hartman, her ill-fated attempt to evict a man she wrongly believed to be a squatter ended up teaching her a lesson in humility, respect, and the importance of doing one's homework before passing judgment. Sometimes, to truly be part of the community, you have to go through the fire and come out changed for the better. And if there's one thing Ethan learned from the experience, it's this: never underestimate the power of owning your story and your house, even when the neighborhood busybody insists you don't belong. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.